Um, Welcome everyone. This is my name is Huy Gardner. I'm the core director of the flow cytometry for Memorial Sloan Kettering, and I'll be moderating this webinar. I want to say just a few things about OpenFlow cytometry. So this is our first OpenFlow cytometry virtual class, and before introducing our speakers and our instructors today, I just want to say that open cytometry is intended to be open source, based interactive learning that is targeted at scientists to provide with expert knowledge in flow cytometry. So from basic to advanced flow cytometry. And I want to make the point that this is really intended to address people that already have some knowledge in flow cytometry. So, we do expect you to know a bit about flow cytometry because we're going to go into the practicalities of how to do flow cytometry in these kind of webinars. And we'll be focusing a lot on implementing best practices. So we'll be starting with monthly live interactive webinars, but it can go really beyond this from providing learning resources, protocols, FAQs, and even discussion forums. So we're still trying to discuss the ways to implement these kind of things, but so it's still open-ended, but we're really excited to start this open flow cytometry. So we do welcome also the participation of other institutions with their expertise if they want to join in this collaborative open source effort. I just want to say that for this session, you can use the QA button below to ask any questions as we go along. We'll try to address those questions if they're relevant to what we're presenting. But if you have some more general questions, we may be leaving them for the end. So please stay tuned for that. And if any questions go unanswered, don't worry. We'll post these answers later. And I also want to emphasize that we will be recording this session, and we will be posting this session later on our YouTube channel, and we'll talk a bit about that later. So again, stay tuned. So with no further ado, I want to introduce then Kathy Daniels, also from Memorial Sloan Kettering. And Kathy, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
All right. Thank you so much, Rui. So yes, as Rui just mentioned, my name is Kathy Daniels. I am the flow cytometry core facility manager here at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. I've had the privilege of working with Rui for about 2 years now, which I'm very grateful for. And I started in flow cytometry roughly 7 years ago this month, actually. So this is my 7th anniversary of working with in flow cytometry. And I'm really excited about today. I'm pretty passionate about open access resources for education and flow cytometry, and looking forward to joining on this journey with Rui and Derek and all of our attendees. And with that, I pass it along to Derek.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, my name's Derek Davis, and I'm the STP, or Science Technology Platform Training Lead at the Francis Crick Institute here in London, which is quite a long way away from New York. So obviously this is quite a nice occasion to be able to collaborate with people across the other side of the Atlantic. Many of you might know that for many years I ran the core flow cytometry facility at the London Research Institute, and more recently the Francis Crick Institute. So I have about 35 years experience of flow cytometry, and one of the reasons I moved into a training role is because I think an understanding of the technology that we use is vital to making sure we get the best out of it. And I think both of our facilities are very good at training people to use the flow cytometers. So as Rui said, and this webinar is only going to be an hour, so we can't hope to teach you the whole of cytometry in that hour. We will be following up with a couple more webinars in the next months. Again, more details of that at the end. But today, what we wanted to do was try and get the basic principles across. So when we come to our next webinar, we'll be able to jump straight in and set up an experiment. Also, this is obviously very much specific for BD machines. We're going to be looking very specifically at the FACSDiva software that controls the BD machine. But at the same time, we want to give you an overview of the principles. And these principles will be the same whether we're using a different cytometer and a different software as well. It may look slightly different, the buttons will be in different places, but the approach will be the same. So this is sort of what we're going to look at. We're going to look initially at the cytometer we're going to use and how we ensure that our cytometer works properly. That'll be relatively general. Then there'll be some parts that are much more specific for Diva. And then at the end of it, we're going to try to run a very simple flow cytometry experiment. Okay, so we're not going to be running a 25 color panel today, but maybe we'll try and get there in the next few weeks. So pretty much the first question you're going to ask is, what cytometer am I going to run my experiment on? Sometimes that's going to be the limiting factor. If you're lucky enough to work in a core facility, you've probably got a choice of cytometers that you can use, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you just have one, and you may be limited by what you can do on that. So the first thing to always find out is what you're going to use. So how many lasers does my flow cytometer have? That's going to influence which fluorochromes you can use. It's no good trying to design an experiment with a UV excitable dye if you don't have a UV laser on your cytometer. Secondly, we need to know how many detectors we have available. Again, if I've got a 12 color flow cytometer, I can't design a 16 color panel to run on that. I'm always going to be limited with what I have at my disposal. And it's not just that overarching things, but also the specifics. You know, which optical filters do I have in my cytometer? Because that's going to help me think about which fluorochromes I might be able to use together. And we can get this information hopefully very easily. If you work in a core facility, something like this will probably be stuck on the cytometer itself, or at least downloadable from a website. So this is the configuration of the cytometer we're going to be using today. It's a 5 laser BD LSR Vortessa. And this schematic gives me the information that I want to know. So by looking here, I can see I've got 5 lasers, and I can see that they're also spatially separated. We'll come back to that in a moment. But I can see that I have a UV laser, and I have 3 detection channels in my UV laser. So I know I can excite some of the dyes that are excitable by UV, but I know I can only do 3. We've also got a violet laser. Now, violet laser has 6 detection channels. We have a blue laser, and the blue laser has 4 channels, but you'll notice that only 2 of them are fluorescence channels. We're also going to be measuring forward scatter and side scatter generated from our blue laser, and that's the case with most flow cytometers. Not all, but most of them use the 488 laser to detect scattered light. We also have a 561 or yellow-green laser that allows us to look at 4 parameters, and then finally a red laser, another 3 parameters. So that works out as 18 fluorescence detection channels and 2 scatter parameters. So that's quite a sophisticated cytometer. And in fact, that's the limit of the BD LSR range. So whether it's an LSR2, a Vortessa, or an X20, 20 parameters is the most we can do. So this is quite a big one. If I go back to that UV laser, it's not just the number of parameters I can look at, it's also the optical filters that I have in front of the detector, because those are what are going to limit the fluorochromes that I can measure. So here, this machine is set up to measure brilliant UV 737, BUV 496, and BUV 396. That doesn't mean to say that I have to use those fluorochromes. If I wanted to use a different BV, I could, and I would change the optical filter that we have in front of it. I would still be limited to 3, but I have a little bit of flexibility. So why is it important to know which filters we have in there? Well, flow cytometry is a fluorescence-based technology, as we all know, and these things are very useful, aren't they? Spectral viewers. This is the excitation spectrum and emission spectrum in solid here of PE. And we can see from the excitation spectrum that PE is almost optimally excited at 561 nanometers, the yellow-green laser. But we also know that it can be excited by the 488 laser. And if we had a green 532 laser, that would also excite PE. But I'm always going to choose to try and excite it with the most optimal wavelength, which in this case is 561. Remember, this filled line is the emission spectrum, and spectrum is the important word there, isn't it? We don't just get one wavelength of light from our fluorochrome. And in a traditional flow cytometer, we don't collect all of the light either from that fluorochrome. We just collect a part of it, and that's what that optical filter does. So if you'd have actually looked at that small print on the previous slide, you would have seen that we have a 586/15 band pass filter for our PE detector. Now, what does that mean? Well, a band pass filter has a very specific definition. So if I take this example, BP band pass 500/50, that means that this filter allows 50 nanometers worth of light to pass through it, centered at 500. So if you look at the transmission curve, sorry, this is very small, it will allow light between 475 and 525 to pass through it. So 50 nanometers worth of light centered at 500. So that PE filter that we looked at, if I go to the manufacturer's website, I can get the transmission curve of that filter, and I can see that it's centered at 586, and it allows 15 nanometers worth of light to pass through it. So now I've got an idea of the cytometer that I'm going to use. I know how many lasers, I know how many detectors, I know which filters I have. I now need to know that it's working correctly. So we're always going to need to have some form of quality control. Now, why do we need that? Because if we see a difference in our samples, we want to be sure that that's a real biological effect, a real biological variation, not just a variation of our flow cytometer. And there are many things that we can check on our cytometer. We're going to concentrate on three of those here today: the alignment of our lasers, the sensitivity of our detectors, and the laser delay, because you remember our lasers are spatially separated in this cytometer. So what do I mean by that, and how can we do it? So remember, in our cytometers, we hydrodynamically focus cells so that, as far as possible, they're being aligned so that we can make single cell measurements. Remember, a flow cytometer is a single cell measuring device. But we want to know that our laser beam hits our cell, our stream of cells, at the right point, so that the cells are going through the center of the laser beam each time, and we're collecting that light appropriately. Now, for most of our analyzers, which obviously is what we're using today, that's fixed. We can't do laser alignment very easily. Well, not to say you can't do it, but we certainly wouldn't encourage it. But we do need to check it. And the way we do that is by using beads. Obviously, we do a lot of work with beads. So if I buy beads from a manufacturer that have a given size and a given amount of fluorescence, I can use them to monitor the performance of my cytometer. And what I'm looking at here is the spread of this, because these beads are all uniform, same size, same amount of fluorescence. And what I'm looking at is this, the CV, the coefficient of variation, which is a statistical term, a measure of data spread. It's the standard deviation divided by the mean, expressed as a percentage. So if I run beads at a regular intervals, now that could be weekly, it could be daily. Some people will even run a QC immediately before their experiment. That gives me the chance to monitor this, to monitor the day-to-day stability of my cytometer, which hopefully allows me to pick up problems before they become too big a problem. And in some applications, particularly DNA cell cycle analysis, we really want to make sure our cytometer is performing as well as it can do. But it's not just alignment, it's also about the sensitivity of our detectors. And what I mean by sensitivity is how well my cytometer can pick up something that's weakly stained above something that's unstained. Now, this is probably one of the areas of cytometry where there's probably the least amount of consensus about how we do this, other than we should do it. We should make some attempt to check how sensitive our cytometer is. And sensitivity is dependent on mainly three things: how efficient our detectors are at converting light into a signal we can measure, a thing that we call Q; the background of the system, which is mostly autofluorescence of our particles, or a bit of background fluorescence, but also the background noise that we have in our system. So what signal would we see in the absence of a cell? I'm not really going to go into those, or we're not going to go into those in much more detail. But other than to say that we assess sensitivity with beads, of course we do. But rather than now using a single peak bead, we use a multi-peak bead set, anywhere between 3 and 8. So this is a 6-peak bead set. And by 6 peaks, what we mean is we've got 6 levels of fluorescence. So for each of my fluorescence channels, I've got a very bright bead, a negative bead, and then 4 beads of intermediate fluorescence. And again, by running these on a daily or weekly basis, I can check the spread, the CV of these peaks, and I can check the separation, maybe the distance between these two dimmest populations, or the dimmest and the negative population. And as long as that stays consistently, I'm happy that my cytometer is working correctly. And then the final thing we want to check is the laser delays. So remember, in the multi-laser system, my cells will pass through laser 1. So in this case, a blue laser. We capture the fluorescence that's emitted and measure it. A few microseconds later, that cell will pass through the second laser, red laser. Again, emit photons. We can capture those and measure them. Similarly, a little bit later on, it goes through laser 3 and laser 4, and so on. Now, in a fixed system, this distance, this physical distance, is set. But it's not just that physical distance, it's how long a cell may take to pass through that. And that may vary with slight changes of pressure in my system. So again, it's something that we want to check during our QC process. So that's three things we want to check, isn't it? Alignment, sensitivity, and laser delay. Several beads that are going to do that. Luckily, with the system we're going to look at now, we're going to do that in one shot. We're going to use what BD calls CS&T beads, cytometer setup and tracking. Now, I won't go into this too much because we're going to see it live, but we have two different sizes of beads, which we can see here, and three different levels of fluorescence, a negative, a dim, and a bright bead. And that's going to allow us to monitor those three things: alignment, sensitivity, and laser delay. So we don't want to do too many slides here. Obviously, this is mainly practical, so that's enough from me. I'm going to hand you over to Kathy now, who's sitting in front of the Fortessa, and we're going to run through the QC.
Yes, Kathy, before you start, we actually have a question here that I think is quite pertinent. Somebody's asking if you can't see the rate is the whole feed. Does it denote a problem with the cytometer, or is just the property of the fluorophore?
Okay, that's a good question, actually, because those 6 peak beads that we use are generally not completely optimal for every laser and every channel that we measure. So particularly in the far red channels, we don't always see the 6 or the 8 peaks. The beads that we're going to use now have been optimized for each laser and each channel. So although we use 6 peak beads as a quick look-see, if I was really wanting to quantify my the QC of my machine, I would use the CS&T beads that we're going to use now.
Absolutely. All right, and that was a great question. Thank you so much. And we encourage everyone to utilize that Q&A function as we go along. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually share my screen, and we're going to go into Diva itself. Okay. So typically, what we have on every cytometer is some type of an acquisition software. So when we're working with BD instruments, what we do is we open up FACSDiva for most all of the BD analyzers. And when you open it up, what's going to wind up happening is you'll see this login screen. And it's a unique identifier for you to be able to log in and access your account. So for today, we're going to open up our training account, which is our OpenFlow account. And I'm going to put in our password and just log right in. And when we go in, and after we log in, the first thing that we're going to do, like Derek mentioned, is we're going to carry out our instrument QC. Our instrument QC that we're going to carry out is the CS&T, or cytometer setup and tracking. And in order for us to do that, what I'm going to do after I log in is I'm going to come up to the cytometer tab right up here, and I'm going to choose CS&T. Okay? That's the cytometer setup and tracking. What you'll see right here, though, before I click on that little button, is down here on the status bar, if you can see my mouse, we see that it says that the Diva software is connected. So it's going to wind up happening when I click on cytometer and I choose to go into cytometer setup and tracking. You'll notice that that has now been disconnected, and it's connecting into the CS&T software, which is a separate software than Diva. Just very quickly, I'm going to change it so that you can see my pointer a little bit better there now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the CS&T beads that I've already made up, and typically it's about 2 drops of beads and 500 microliters of the diluent, which is the sheet fluid. And I'm going to switch over from a tube that I had of water to a tube of CS&T, and I'm going to load them on before I started in the software, and I'm going to start running it on low. Okay? And what we see here in the software is, as a user, I really don't have many options to pick from aside from the lot of the beads and the ability to run. So the lot of beads that I'm currently working with on this instrument is 83326. So that's currently selected. But if you're working with another lot and that lot was in there, you'd be able to scroll down and select that. I'm going to hit run so that we can get started with our CS&T, since it does take a couple of minutes. And it's letting us know that we can load those CS&T beads and that we can also check our fluidic levels. Okay. I'm going to hit OK because I know that my sheath is full and my waste is empty. And what winds up happening is it automatically starts running the cytometer setup and tracking. Now, as we're going through this, and what you'll be able to see as we're going along is some events that are coming up, but it's a little bit hard to see. And what we'll wind up seeing across this whole process is the populations will shift, they'll be adjusting, we'll start seeing some populations coming up. But that, like just right there, right? So we see some forward and side scatter events popping up there, and our performance check is starting to be run. Now, what the performance check does, like Derek mentioned a little bit earlier, it checks the status of the instrument, and it's tracking it typically from day to day if you're running it on a daily basis. Okay, it checks the linearity of the instrument. It checks the CVs of the bright peaks, because there are 3 different peaks that we're going to wind up seeing by fluorescence. There's 2 by scatter that you're going to be able to see, and there's going to be 3 by fluorescence. And it's going through and it's checking all the different aspects of the parameter to make sure it's in an operational, that it's operational and available for you to use. Now, it's important here to note that the performance check is done on a daily basis, or sometimes it's done before each experiment. But what the CS&T is actually referring to, in order to make sure that it's in its best working order, the instrument's in its best working order, is the cytometer baseline report. So I'm going to toggle through here and go from setup, which is the active run right here, to reports. And when we go to the reports option, or that tab right there, as I come down, you can see this instrument's used quite a bit over the years. And there are baselines that are run, and then there are performance checks. And you can see that difference here. So if I toggle over, it's the cytometer performance. And if I toggle here, it's a cytometer baseline. So if I click on that cytometer baseline, even though it's actively running at performance, it gives me the ability to check and see the baseline that was defined for this instrument just recently in March, on March 13th, 2020. This is typically done when an instrument's installed, or when a preventative maintenance is carried out, or any major interventions are done, or if lots are being transferred out. And the cytometer baseline, what that does is it goes ahead and it checks for instrument linearity and the linearity of all the detectors. It checks for that photon counting efficiency, or the Q, the optical background, the B, and it also takes into account the standard deviation of electronic noise, like Derek was mentioning. So this baseline report is going to be pretty in-depth, and there's going to be a lot going on, and typically that's something that the administrator will be running on a routine basis, okay? You're only going to have to worry about the performance check as a daily user, if that's something that you carry out in your facility as a method of QC. But I want you to understand that the baseline is what's defining target values, okay? So from day to day, what winds up happening, if I go back to this setup, is we're seeing that the instrument is going to be, or we're seeing that the cytometer setup and tracking is going to go ahead and try and hit a target value for these bright beads in all of the detectors from day to day and from run to run of performance check. Okay. So we see that these peaks are nice and tight, and that's what we're looking for in this bright population right here. So we have our bright, we have our mid, and we have our dim. And it's making all of the adjustments to laser delay and to all the instrument settings and PMT voltages. It's adjusting them from day to day and from run to run to make sure that the instrument is at a comparable point from day to day, okay? So it's important for us to understand why we're actually carrying out this CS&T performance check and what the instrument's actually doing. So we have the baseline that we're defining, typically once every 6 months, like I said, or at any major interventions or PMs. And then our daily check of the QC itself is done with a performance check. Okay, so once the performance check is done, it's going to tell us that we can unload the tube, so we can see it real time here. And once I do that and I hit OK, it's telling me that setup completed successfully. Okay? So if I go ahead and I view that report, it's going to give me a readout, and it's going to tell me very easily right here with this green check mark that everything passed as we expect it to. So this is what you want to look for. And it's an important note here that as you're going ahead and as you're running the performance check or any type of QC that's defined by your facility, if it does not meet the acceptance criteria, typically what we suggest in our facility is to do a round of deep cleaning, because most often there might be an issue with the cleanliness, and then try and repeat. But it's very important that if you're having repeated issues with instrument QC failures or anything along those lines, you want to make sure that you reach out to the members of your facility to let them know that there is an issue before you proceed, or reach out to your local field service engineer if you're not working in an SRL and you have your own instrument. So that's a very important note right there. But now that this passed, I can go ahead and I can close out of the cytometer setup and tracking.
Kathy,
Yes.
I have a few questions here from the audience. So the one question here that is asking about the QR values, and this is a question for
I'm a little bit of a hard time hearing there, Rui.
yeah. Can you hear me well now?
Yes.
Okay, so when it comes to QR values, the baseline, are there any typical values that should be expected from the cytometer? So it depends whether there's an bending problem.
Sorry, I might open up
Yeah.
that Q&A myself.
Yeah. Okay, so Kathy, so the question is about the QR values that we get in the report. And
Okay.
is there a typical value for those?
No, so there's not a typical value. That's actually somewhat arbitrary, and we're not going to go into too many details with that today. Typically, what winds up happening is, you know, if you have a bit of a higher Q value and a lower B, that typically winds up being a little bit better for resolution. But there's no defining number that I would, you know, that we're going to say at this time would be recommended for you. But that's something sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say that the QR is going to be dependent on the particular machine, because it's a function of the optical filters in there and the actual PMT itself. So it may be different between machines, but you know what it is for your machine, and you can monitor that over time, and that's what QC is doing.
Yeah.
And actually, there's another question that a couple of people have asked about. Obviously, this worked quite nicely here, didn't it? And it passed, but sometimes it passes with warnings.
Mm-hmm.
And would we always proceed when it does that? Or
That's a great
deal with it?
That's a great question. And I think from my experience, most often what winds up happening is typically when you have it passing with warnings, it tends to be based on CV, right? And it's the robust standard deviation of that bright peak of the beads. So that is something that's typically up to the discretion of the facility. And you want to be very mindful that you're aware of what the actual warning is. So if we go back, I'm just going to go back to the performance check real quick. If we go to performance tracking, I can show you an example of when we did have a passing with warnings. So if we go to the reports and I scroll down very quickly, we can see here on one of our recent runs that the CV was at 6.15 and the passing criteria for that was 6. Ideally, you do want it to pass, but you want to be mindful of what your experiment is and what you're looking to do. If you're trying to take a look at cell cycle, the CV and the tightness of the peak is going to be very, very critical. When you're looking at fluorescence data, it might not be as critical, but I would always advocate for you to get a CS&T or any QC passing without warnings as opposed to having it pass with warnings. Any other questions?
Yes. Actually, there's a question here on how often the Cytometer baseline measurement should be done.
So the baseline, with any major intervention at the time of installation, or it typically has to be done every 6 months because it expires at the 6-month point. So typically what you'd have to do is run it in advance of that 6 months. And if you're an administrator and you're running the baseline, I would suggest making sure the performance check passes to make sure the instrument's in a good condition before you rerun baseline.
Let me see. There are a few questions here also. All right, so this is regarding the lot number. So there are actually a few questions here on what do these different lots differ, and also what are they about, right? So I basically answered already in what the idea of the different lots is. So they have different target values, and so basically that's used for the software to know if these target values are being reached or not as a performance measure. But there's a question here also asking, can you also talk about how to load beads info into Diva from the website? We're talking about the lot number, right?
Oh, so how to import the specific bead lot information into Diva.
Exactly.
I think that's a discussion for another day so that we can get into a little bit more of the experiment. It's a very basic thing to do. We can always post a very quick informational guide on that on the YouTube channel that we'll have, or we can walk you through it very briefly after if we have time. Yeah. Okay. And with that, I'll pass it back along to Derek for a couple more slides before we get started with the experiment.
Yeah, sorry. Do you want to answer, Derek, also this question here of when running CS&T, if the machine actually makes adjustments so that it reaches targets in the baseline report, and what are the ways in which these changes are made?
Yes, I mean, I suppose one of the things that we will do in the next webinar is look at changing the voltage and how that affects the signals that we're getting. But that, in effect, is what CS&T is doing. It's taking either a target value or values that we've defined and sort of altering the voltage to make that to make that peak appear in the same place, which is then something that we can monitor over time. And if the changes we have to make are outside a defined range that we can define, it's going to pass or fail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important to also note that in terms of the voltages that one is going to use afterwards, there's this thing called application settings that can be used by Diva that will take that information and adjust voltages. But that's going already more into detail. What Kathy was showing here is more QC performance check, right? To know if those target values are being
Interestingly, as Rui said at the beginning, this is the first time we've done this, so it's much of an exercise for us as it is for you guys. And obviously one of the things that's coming out here is that maybe we need to think more about explaining what CS&T does. But for the purposes of today, we're doing it because we're making sure that the machine is fit for purpose for the very simple experiment that we're going to do next. So hopefully you should now be able to see my screen, which is going to tell us what we're going to do. So we've taken some cells. These are called Cytometry cells, which we get from Beckman Coulter. And these are freeze-dried lyopholized lymphocytes. Okay, so we use these quite a lot if we're titrating CD markers, for example, or in demonstrations like this. Very easy cells to work with. You just reconstitute them and we can stain them with anything that we like. And in this case, we've stained them with CD4 PE. Now, I'm not an immunologist, but I know that CD4 stains a subset of lymphocytes, the T helper cells. And I know it's been labeled with PE. So in terms of the cytometer, I need to know that really the only fluorochrome I want to measure is PE. So we're going to run a very simple experiment. We've got two tubes, in fact, almost the simplest experiment we could have. We've got one that's unstained and then one that we've stained with the CD4 PE antibody. So this is where one of those areas, I suppose, where it doesn't matter which cytometer we're using, because we're going to have to decide now which plots we want to put up in our software that are going to help us answer the question that we want to answer, which is how many of my cells are expressing CD4. So why would we put up a histogram compared to a dot plot? for example. But we also have to remember that our cytometers don't really have any intelligence of their own. They're going to measure everything that's in our tube, but not everything in our tube is necessarily what we want. We know we're going to have some debris in there. We're going to have doublets. We may have some dead cells, although we don't have a viability diet in here today. So we're always going to want to exclude those to make sure we're making measurements on the things that we're interested in. And then we're going to have to think about some practicalities. You know, how many events do we want to acquire? Where are we going to store these? How are we going to get them to our analysis computer and so on? And again, we're not going to talk specifically about data analysis, but we will start sowing the seeds of how we're going to do that. So one thing I wanted to put up here before we come to the cytometer is how we can think about removing doublets in any flow cytometry experiment. And, you know, that's important because, as we said earlier, flow cytometry is a single cell technology. It's one of the most powerful aspects of flow. So we really want to make sure that we're making measurements only on single cells. So to do that, we have to think a little bit about how a flow cytometer is making a measurement. So if we take our cells and they're traveling in this direction here, as soon as my cell enters the laser beam, any fluorochromes on that cell are starting to be excited. So I get photons, I pick them up with my detection system. With this machine is a PMT, a photomultiplier tube, and I start seeing my signal. A few microseconds later, that cell is now completely within the laser beam. So all of my fluorochromes are being excited multiple times. I'm getting a lot of photons out. My signal increases. And then my cell starts to exit the laser beam. And as soon as the cell is out of the laser beam, it's no longer fluorescent. So I'm getting fewer photons being produced and my signal decays. So we get this pulse of light for every detection channel we have on our flow cytometer. So in this case, 20 detection channels. And we can measure three things about that pulse of light. We can measure the height of that pulse, which is the equivalent of when the cell is in the middle of the beam. It's completely illuminated. We can measure the width of that pulse, which gives us an idea of how long that event takes to pass through the laser beam. And we can measure the area under that pulse. And normally the area gives us the best measure of total fluorescence. But we can use these three parameters to help us exclude doublets, because if I have a single cell, I get this nice Gaussian distribution. Remember, we can measure those three things. But if I have two cells that pass through very close together, rather than the Gaussian distribution, I get this sort of camel hump. And to the cytometer, that may look like that's a single cell. But I can still measure those three parameters about it. Now, the thing about this is the height of these pulses would be the same, but the area and the width will be different. The area of the doublet will be bigger than the area of a singlet. The width of the doublet will be bigger than the width of a singlet population. So I can use that to help me exclude doublets. We'll see this live in a second, but here I've looked at the area and the height of my forward scatter signal. No matter whether I get a small pulse or a medium pulse or a large pulse, the area and the height will be in proportion. So my single cells will fall up the diagonal. When I get this sort of shape, that's no longer the case. So my doublets fall off the diagonal and I can specifically exclude them. Or I can use the width of the parameter. They said the width, remember, is the time it takes to pass through the laser beam. So again, with my single cell, it's going to take less time than my doublets. And the number of the ways you exclude doublets depends on the question you're asking. We'll address that in a minute in the live run. So let's go back to Diva. Let's go back to Kathy and we'll set the machine up for this experiment.
Great, thank you, Derek. So here we go. So now that we're back in Diva, one important thing to note that I kind of went quickly through before is that typically when you disconnect again from CS&T, go back into Diva, there's an option there, and this will come up for some users. And when it comes up with a mismatch dialog, you always want to use the CS&T settings because you have the most updated laser delays there. So now that we're all on the same page with that, let me just go ahead. The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go ahead and either create a folder if we want to have a subfolder for within our browser, or we want to go ahead and create an experiment. For today in the browser, I'm going to go ahead and make an experiment. And it's important to know that there's always multiple ways to do things in Diva. So if I come up here and I click experiment, new experiment, it's going to give me the option to create a new experiment from there with any available templates. Or if I just want to create a blank experiment, I can come right here, and whenever I hover over anything, it's going to give me the option of what I can do. So I'm going to click on new experiment right there, and it automatically shows some different options for me. You see my global worksheet where I'm going to see my data starts populating and starts showing a grid. We see some different information in the inspector, all of that. So we're started already with the first step of the experiment. From there, we're going to go ahead and create a specimen. So that's essentially like a group, okay? So if I go ahead and I create the specimen and I expand out on that, I have a tube that's now associated with my experiment. There's a lot for us to go over in the Diva software, and one of the first things that we're going to go over is the different options and what they're able to do. So Derek's actually going to go over for us what the Cytometer tab actually goes through and what that Cytometer window actually goes through. So if we go through, if I click on this tube right here, what you'll notice is that before I clicked on that, there was no options, but now that I did, it's there. So I'll let Derek walk through the Cytometer window.
Yeah, that's sometimes a little confusing, I think, for new users, that you actually have to click the bookmark in the left-hand side to activate the inspector for the cytometer. You can see where Kathy's got her mouse hovering, that there are 5 tabs there. The first one is status. I do like to monitor that, because if there's any problem in the cytometer, that will appear there. So if you're running out of sheath fluid, for example, that would appear in there, but as long as that isn't red, I'm quite happy. If we click the next one, the parameters, this tells us all of the things that I can measure on this flow cytometer. Remember, we looked at the cytometer configuration earlier. Now you'll notice on the left-hand column there that the file or parameter has been given the name of a fluorochrome. Okay, so there are different ways that people set up these parameters. So on this cytometer, that parameter has been set up with the name of the fluorochrome that's going to be measured in that channel. Alternative way to do that may be to put the optical filter in there. So rather than it saying FITC, it may say 530/30 blue, which would mean that's the bandpass filter from the blue laser. And you know, one way isn't better than the other, but it's important to know that, again, there are different ways of doing that. So this shows me the 20 different parameters I can measure on this flow cytometer. We're not measuring 20 colors in a moment, so when we actually come to run the experiment, we'll remove the parameters that we're not interested in. We'll show you how to do that. The next line along is the voltage that we're going to, oh, sorry, Kathy, I'm still in their parameters. The next line along is the voltage that we're going to apply to that detector. Now, because we've run the CS&T, the quality control setup, CS&T has given us a suggested voltage for each of the parameters there. Now, one thing I always say to everybody is you're always in control of your experiment. If you want to change something, you can, but you need to know what the consequences of changing that are. And I think we'll probably address this more in the next webinar when we look at what is the appropriate voltage to use. So I'm not going to go into that too much now. The third column there says log. Okay, so this is where we are going to decide whether we're going to use a linear or a logarithmic amplification. And normally we would use a linear amplification when the range of signals isn't very broad. So normally scatter, or if we were looking at, again, DNA content. But for most immunofluorescent staining, we use log, because the difference between the positive and the negative population is maybe 100 or 200 fold. So we need a log scale to see that. And then the final 3 columns there are labeled A, H, and W. And as we've just seen, they stand for area, height, and width, the signal. So again, in a moment when we come to set up, the default is it's just set for area. Okay? If we want to measure the height and the width, we have to specifically tell Diva to do that. Okay, so we have to click that box, which again, we'll come to in a second. So the next tab along there from parameters is threshold. Now, hopefully most of you are familiar with cytometry, and that we apply a threshold, and the threshold is an electronic hurdle, if you like, above which a signal has to jump before we measure it. So anything that's below that threshold we won't see, is invisible. So we'll see again when we set this experiment up how we can vary that threshold to exclude things that we're not interested in. But anything that we can change, we have to, again, know what's going to happen, what the effect of changing that is. The third tab says laser. Now, sometimes, depending on the permissions you've been given, you may not get to see this tab at all. But this is where you can see the laser delays. So it gives us the order of the lasers that is set up on this cytometer. Well, again, we may come back to that a little bit later on. The compensation tab. Now, compensation, again, is something we're not going to cover today, but we will do that at a later stage. Remember, compensation allows us to account for fluorescence overlap, and because we have 20 or 18 different fluorochromes that we can measure in this system, we can compensate any fluorochrome against any other. So if you scroll down, Kathy, you'll see that that list is huge, because it's every combination of fluorochromes that we can measure. Okay, so I always start with looking at that tab because it becomes important in thinking about how we're going to set the cytometer up. But now I'll hand back to Kathy and we'll actually set the page up for what we want to do today. Remember, we're just looking at single color fluorescence from some lymphocytes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Derek. So yes, like Derek mentioned, we're going to be going over a simple one color experiment. So what I'm first going to do, just to let everyone know, in the browser, once you click on different sections, it is going to change what it allows you to do in the inspector. So you can see once I clicked on the experiment, it gives me the option to rename as it highlights all of the text blue. Alternatively, I can come into the inspector and rename it there. So I can just call it training. Okay. We're not going to get into too much detail with that now, but once it's the different options of the inspector, but just be mindful that when you click on different options within your experiment, it's going to change what you can actually go ahead and select. Okay. Once I select on the cytometer settings, it's going to also give me all the different parameters for the experiment, including scatter and fluorescence. So like Derek was talking about, we need to make sure that we enable and check height and width in addition to area for our scatter so that we can differentiate between single cells and aggregates of cells. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and choose which fluorescent detectors we want to leave open for our experiment. You do have the option to keep all of the detectors open. That's a matter of personal preference. But because I'm looking at just PE today, and that's all that we're looking at, I don't need to have every single fluorescent detector open because that just means a larger data file. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just leave the PE detector open, and I'm also going to leave an extra channel open for autofluorescence for a better way to gauge. So I'm going to choose BD 421 for that today, and I'm going to go ahead and click and hit Control as I click and select all the parameters I don't need to use for today. So as I'm going through and clicking all these parameters, by utilizing the Control key, I can select multiple and then delete them using this delete button right here. You can't use the delete button on your keyboard, so don't try that. And one common mistake that people might make is unchecking log, and that would simply go over to linear. Sometimes people think that that allows you to be able to remove the parameter, but it does not. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to expand out on the global worksheet. And once I click on that global sheet one, I'm just going to give myself a little bit more working room. I get a little claustrophobic in the workspace. I'm not sure about anyone else for the worksheet. So I'm going to change the number of pages to 3 and 3 so it really gives me a little bit more space. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start working with my global worksheet. So we went from cytometer to inspector, and now we're in the global worksheet. Okay. When I hover over any option, it's going to tell me what exactly I'm hovering over and the options that I have. But what we're going to start doing is we're going to start working with a dot plot. So if I click on that dot plot and then I click and drag, I just created my first plot. It defaults to forward scatter area on the X by forward scatter height on the Y. I'm going to leave the forward scatter area on the x-axis, and I'm going to change the y by left clicking on this y-axis, and I'm going to choose side scatter area. Okay. From there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start setting up some of the plots that we're going to use from our experiment. And there's multiple ways to do that. So what I'm going to do to make it a little bit easier for us and to also save some time is I'm going to go ahead and put on my unstained cells so I can give you an idea of why I'm setting the gates that we're setting, and just to save a little bit of a time for us today. So I have some unstained cytometry cells that I'm loading, and because I'm just doing some initial setup and plotting and gating, I'm going to run them on low. Okay, so I'm running these on low, and in order for us to be able to see any events, what I need to do at the onset is I need to go ahead and I need to start acquiring. There are multiple options here, so sometimes what people might want to do is they might want to start setting some gates in advance of seeing, in advance of running, because they're pretty well versed in flow cytometry and they know what they're doing. But for a beginner, it's usually a little bit easier to have some cells running to have an idea of where and why to set the gates that you're setting. So what you can see right here when we loaded on those cells is that the plot is looking quite messy. It's not looking like how we'd normally expect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go back to that cytometer window that Derek was speaking of, and I'm going to go to parameters. And when I do that, I can see my voltage for the forward scatter detector and the side scatter detector. So it's 622 and 220. For anyone that's used to looking at flow cytometry data, when we're looking at cells, typically we want them somewhat in the middle of the scale. It's going to depend on the cell types that you're working with. But I want my cytometry cells to be somewhat right about here, if you can see my mouse. So a nice tool to be able to get an idea of where your cells are they on scale, are they off scale? A nice tool for that is to go ahead and start setting some gates and have an idea of what the population percentages are and what percentage is off scale or on scale. So these are the different gate options here. And in order for me to get an idea of the percentage that's off scale, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select a gate, and the gating options are all over here. And I'm going to choose a rectangular gate, and by clicking on that, if I click and drag on any portion, it's going to set a gate. Now, this isn't telling me the information on the percentages or the numbers right now, so what I need to do is I need to right-click on the plot itself, and I need to show the population hierarchy. Once I do that, this is telling me that 67% of the events are essentially off scale. So this is really nice for us to be able to utilize, that we can then understand that we need to decrease that forward scatter voltage. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take a jump down from 622 to 500. And when I hit restart there, you can see now I went from 67% off scale to about 7. And these cells are now showing up in an area that I would expect them to. Okay. I can make minor adjustments and go ahead and get those cells a little bit more on scale. And there we're seeing our cells like we would normally expect to see them. The reason that I had to decrease that scatter voltage so much is because it was actually set for those voltages were actually set for the CS&T beads. Those beads are not cells, so I just needed to make that adjustment.
Can I just say something, Kathy? This is something that sometimes fools people, I think, when they first come to the cytometer, because as you saw, we saw events on the screen, but they were certainly not our cells. That was the debris that we were amplifying too much. And all the events were jammed up against the axis. And sometimes if you're inexperienced, you wouldn't see that. So the more you understand about your cells, the easier this will become. And it all comes with experience.
Exactly, and that's why I like using that that plotting tool or that gating tool, right, and setting it against the axis. Because if you see a majority of your cells are up against the axis, that's an indicator that you'd want to make sure you decrease your voltage. Being mindful that you can actually have occurrences whereby the voltage, if the voltage is up way too high, you can have quite a bit of debris in background as well. The other thing I'm going to mention here, before we get going the rest of the gating, is that you can see that I have quite a few events. So if I come and I look at the acquisition dashboard, what we can see is the number of events that's displaying currently is 50,000. So if I want to see my changes in a more real time, I can go ahead and I can change the number of events to display to 1,000, to 5,000 to a more reasonable number so that it's not looking so messy. Okay. So from there, I set up my first initial gate based on where my cells are falling, and I know that based on experience and what we traditionally expect the cells to look like by scatter. And I'm cutting out some of this debris in this background. From there, I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose drill down. And that option creates a duplicate of this plot that's only showing me what's in that first gate. From there, on the x-axis, I'll choose forward scatter area. And on the y, I'll choose forward scatter height. Okay, that's going to give me the option to start setting a singlet gate. Okay, so what I'll do to set a singlet gate, like Derek was talking about with his slides on height, area, and width, is I set the height versus area, and I'm choosing a polygon right here. And each click is a node. And as I go through, it should be roughly proportional. So as I click and as I make, and I come to the end and I double click, I'm only now looking at my single cells. From there, I'll double click, or I'll right click again and I'll drill down. And we're going to do another singlet gate. So that second singlet gate that we're going to do is going to be side scatter width and side scatter height. I don't know about you, but that green color to me is not my favorite. So I'm going to double click on that and I'm going to change that to a blue that we can see a lot easier. Okay. From there, you can see we didn't exclude all of the aggregates just by this one single cell gate. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create another with width versus height. Okay, so each click again is a node. That fun green color comes back to me, right? It comes back again. I'm going to show you a little workaround for that in a minute. And then I'm going to right click again and I'm going to drill down and we're going to take a look at our two fluorescent parameters. PE, which is the channel of interest for the CD4, and then that channel that I left open for autofluorescence, which is the BD 421. Okay, once I do that, I'm actually going to change the events to display to be a little bit more at 10,000, so I can get a little bit more of a better population showing up. And now I have an idea of my gating strategy, and I'm going to stop acquiring. I'm not going to record anything yet.
So while Kathy's doing that, I'd say the doublet gates that we put on there, how many you use may depend on the question that you're asking. So the rarer the event that you're looking for, the more doublet gating I would do, because I want to be sure in my final analysis, if I see a dot that's double positive, that's something that that is a single cell that's double positive. If I'm just screening transfectants, for example, I may just use one gate, but for most experiments we'd use two.
Yeah. And
piggybacking, sorry, Kathy, piggybacking on that, there are a couple of questions here that are actually interesting. Somebody's asking if using H versus width is different from using H versus area. And the other question is, how do you decide the area? And I think this is very important. How do you decide the area of the gate that you draw for the double discrimination?
So typically, that's a great question. And typically what I recommend to people is that it's kind of dependent on your experiment and on your cells. So I'll always explore different options of height, area, and width for forward scatter and slide scatter for different cell types. And it might pull out a little bit differently for your individual experiment. So there's typically never a one-size-fits-all solution to flow cytometry. And you want to always explore and play with your data to be able to have the best resolution of those single cells. Because just because it works for the lymphocytes for height versus area or the height versus width for these parameters, for side scatter and forward scatter, doesn't mean it will work for your hybridomas or for any of the other tissue you might be working with. So always explore to answer some of those questions.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say I would completely agree with that. Becoming intimate with your data is very important. Yes. And plot everything against everything else, because sometimes you see patterns in one plot that you might not see in another.
Exactly. And that being said, another gate that, or another parameter that everyone hopefully will notice that we didn't have here is a viability plot and a viability gate. That's because these are lyophilized cells, so that we're using them just for training, but it is always advisable to include a viability dye for live cell or fixed cell analysis with the appropriate dyes to make sure that you're looking at live cells only.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions here, and I think this is important. Although we're running a little bit late, but I think these are really relevant questions that people ask all the time when they're doing cytometry, even for more experienced. So somebody's asking about area scaling. This is something that we actually debated, the three of us, whether we would go into details or not. So we won't go into details now, but we'll address this question, offline, and we may be getting back to this in a future webinar. But then there's another question in terms of the gating. Somebody's asking, you seem to have left out the monocytes when you selected the singlets, the population in red now. Is that correct?
Yeah, so sometimes what you'll wind up seeing is you'll see an exaggerated forward scatter profile of aggregates of cells. So if I went ahead and I decreased this gate right here, oh, look, almost all are singlets, right? So you want to be mindful of how you set your gating. And typically, my recommendation and what I do, and it's personal preference, is when I'm doing scatter gating on the onset, I'll typically just tend to exclude debris, but I don't set too tight of a scatter gate because you might be cutting out populations of interest, specifically activated cells that might have a little bit of a different scatter or anything like that. So I typically recommend doing a broad scatter gate and then doing your singlet gating. If I start including this, you might be able to start seeing very clearly here, like Derek mentioned, exploring your data, getting intimate with it. You can see very clearly that those are the aggregates, okay? And you can confirm the gating that you're using with another parameter like side scatter. And that's why it's so nice to have that double doublet exclusion, because as you're going through, maybe you include this and think that's correct, but it's actually aggregates of cells. And that's something that experience will tell you. And then as a second response there, the area scaling factor is going to be very important for singlets. Because these are lymphocytes, the area scaling is pretty nice and on point, but it's not always going to be that way, and we'll address that in future sessions.
Okay, so one final question. Why don't you increase the threshold? I guess somebody is looking at those.
Absolutely, that's a very good question. And as I was saying, threshold is a hurdle above which something has to jump, and you can just about make out that in the sort of bottom left-hand corner of the forward and side scatter plot, there's no data, and that's because we've set the threshold at channel 5000, so anything below that is not going to be seen. So yes, we can do that. We could increase the threshold in this case to maybe 30 or 40,000, which would remove all of that debris. But we have to remember that we need to be sure that we're never going to want information from that population of cells or population of dots there, because it's not going to be recorded. So once you become familiar again with your data, that's maybe what I would do on a routine basis. But certainly when I'm starting an experiment, I would try and keep that relatively low. In fact, I always want to be able to see a little bit of debris there. Yes. Maybe not as much as that. The other thing I could do is also I could decrease the forward scatter voltage a little bit further. That would move some of that debris below the threshold. But again, that's something that you're in control of. So if you want to change that threshold, yes, you can.
Yeah, and just be mindful, like Jared said, that's a very powerful tool. So as you're adjusting it, if you're looking for certain populations of smaller particles or anything like that, you have to be very mindful of the changes that you're making.
It's also dependent on the application, because if I'm looking for example, apoptotic or dead cells, I want to see that area of debris. Whereas here, I'm just interested in my lymphocyte population. I don't care if I've got some dead cells or debris in there.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very valid point. Okay. So now for sake of time, let's just go ahead. But like I said, I didn't record that data just yet. And the reason for that is I want to make sure that my positive population is on scale before I go ahead and I start recording. So I have my PE stained cells here, and I'm going to throw them back on. And this isn't a set, today's session isn't about voltage optimization per se. I'm going to go ahead and start acquiring. So this is a more detailed discussion to be had, but for today, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that that positive population of those CD4 cells is on scale. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing that it's at about 10 to the 5th, which is about 100,000 as we're looking at this plot. I want to make sure that it's not off scale. Okay, when you have off scale data, you can't rely on the statistics. I often equate it to taking a picture with someone's head cut off. You don't know what color their hair is. You don't know if they have two heads. You don't know if they have a hat on. you can be missing out on multiple populations that you're not aware of, and your statistics will be off. So for my purposes for right now, I'm okay just leaving this voltage as is, because I have my my cells on scale. Again, in future sessions, we're going to be talking about optimization of voltages and multiple methods for that. Okay. So now that I know that all of my settings are correct, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put my unstained cells right back on. Okay. So I'm going to put those cells on. I'm going to come here to my browser. I'm going to right click on that tube and I'm going to rename it. And I'm going to call those my unstained cells. Oh, those are my CS&T beads very clearly. So you can see the difference in scatter by those
labeling your tubes is very important in cytometry.
It is. I labeled and I did not look, so looking is very important. Absolutely. Let's see. Hopefully I did the right one here. Okay, perfect. So now I have my my scatter gate and my two singlet gates. And what I'm going to do right here in this acquisition dashboard is I'm going to define how many cells I'm going to record. So it's very important to differentiate between stopping gate and storage gate. We want to use the stopping gate to define what gate we want to record a minimum number of events in. So what I'm going to do for the sake of today is I'm going to record 20,000 in P3, which is my single cell, and I'm going to hit record. As that's recording, it's important to note that the storage gate will give me the options of P1, P2, and P3 as well. If I select that, what's going to wind up happening is it's only going to record the events that fall within that gate that you defined. So you have to be very mindful that if you were to choose P3 as your storage gate and record, you're only going to see events that fall here, here, and here, or here, here, and there. So it has to meet all three criteria because it's parental gating, and you're going to essentially look like you have 100% single cells. So I typically advise against that unless you're very sure of the application and what you're using it for like such as rare cells, and maybe you have some red blood cells still in your prep or something like that, but it's not something that's typically suggested. Now what we can do is I can set another gate based on my PE, and for this I'm going to use a polygon as well, like we used for our single cell gates. And I'm going to come here and I'm going to define this area based on my unstained as my PE positive. I'm going to put these back on. Hopefully I selected the right tube this time. And I'm going to start acquiring. And what we can see here is we can see our positive. Now I can either choose to record 20,000 events again, understanding that I have a 50% positive and I'll wind up with 10,000 positive cells. Or if you were working with a rare event or something like that, where you needed more cells to be acquired, you could select that final gate and dictate how many cells that you want to record from that. I'm going to leave it at P3. I'm going to record. What I'm going to do first is go to next tube though. So this is good. You can see all the different ways that Diva will give you warnings. So
luckily Diva will tell you though, won't it, that you're going to
exactly
go in there.
Exactly.
So that's good.
So I'm going to rename that, call that CD4PE. And then I'm going to start acquiring, and then I'm going to record. Typically, I like acquiring a little bit first before I record so I could just see the data. Some people go straight to record. I typically like making sure it's the correct.
Yeah, I would say that that's not a good idea to go straight to record, because when you put that tube on, it takes a few seconds for the laminar flow and hydrodynamic focusing to settle down. Yeah. So I normally get into the habit of acquiring, seeing that everything looks okay, then hit record.
Exactly. And like I said, we only have the hour for today, and we're a little bit over that hour already. But what winds up happening is there's so much more that we're going to get into over the next couple of months, going over different methods of QC, different methods of gating, all these different intricacies of Diva. But for today, we've already in the past hour gone over QC and running a very basic one color experiment, which is pretty nice.
Exactly. And what we do in future sessions will also be led by you, our audience. If you've got any specific things that you want us to cover, let us know. I mean, we've already seen today that we probably could have spent longer on CS&T. The question of area scaling factor has come up. we can address all of those things in future webinars.
Absolutely. And just one little cool trick that I do want to show, because I was planning on showing a bunch of neat little tricks in Diva that we're not going to have the time for today. But just one thing that's kind of cool that I like to show everyone is if you hit the shift key and you have a polygon gate, you don't have to drag the individual nodes to make it bigger or smaller. If you hit that shift and you want to make any adjustments, it will actually make the whole gate bigger or smaller. So out of the options that I have to choose from today to tell you any tips, that's the one that I'm going to choose, and we'll go over more in future sessions. So now that we have our data and we did a run, there's multiple options as far as changing colors, changing background colors, changing gate names. But what we're going to do for today is just move forward with the exporting of the data. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you here in the browser how we export. There are multiple ways to export data. The first is exporting the experiment. And I want everyone to recognize that when we export our data as an experiment, that is Diva specific. So you can't export your experiment and expect to load those FCS files into a third-party software. But it's a nice method for you to be able to re-import it back into Diva at later times. So I'm going to right-click on the experiment, go down to export, and from experiments, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the appropriate directory where I want my experiment. I can hit browse to change that location, and I'm just going to put it on the desktop for now, hit export, and hit OK. So now I have the experiment itself that I can load back into Diva. And then the next step is going to be to export the FCS files. So if I hit export and I go to FCS files, it's going to give me different options, and we leave it as the default of FCS 3.0. It's a little bit confusing to some when they see that this is in linear, but that is as expected. You don't make any changes here. We're going to hit OK. And then I can choose the correct file path again. So I'm going to go to Browse and Desktop. And I would typically have a folder for myself there on a server. I'm going to choose the directory and save. Okay. Oh, well, I should have created the subfolder because I already have the experiment there and it's going to have similar names. So let me just go ahead and create a subfolder there specifically for those FCS files. So export FCS files, okay. Hit browse. And I can right click and create a new folder from the FCS files for training. And once I do that, and I choose that directory and save, now those FCS files are there. If the naming is the same, it's going to try and overwrite it and give me that warning.
So some facilities will have specific ways that you're supposed to name or store or export your data. So there may be local rules that are slightly different there, but the principle is the same.
Exactly, exactly. The last way that we can go ahead and, or the last export that we're going to do is we're going to actually show you how to save a template very quickly in case you wanted to repeat this in the future. So if you wanted to repeat this basic experiment using the same settings and gates and everything that we've set up today, if you right click, you can export and choose experiment template. Once you do that, if you have it under general, it'll go specifically there under general. And when you go to create a new experiment from the experiment window right here or the tab right here, it'll give you this as an option. So if I hit training, and I do 05-22-20 and hit finish, it now creates that experimental template for us. So that in the future, if I hit experiment and new experiment, there's going to be quite a few here, but it's going to be right here in this general tab. So we have quite a few, but if I hit this training option that we selected for today and that I exported as, once I hit OK, everything that we've set up today is now here. So we went a little bit quick to the exporting and the experimental run, but that's a very quick run through of running a basic experiment in Diva on the Fortessa or LSR Fortessa.
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you, Kathy. We have actually still a few questions here on Diva, so maybe you should keep that shared screen.
Sorry.
So one of the questions was, somebody noticed that you used for decades and not 5. Any specific reason there?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, somebody noticed that you used 4 decades and not 5. Any specific reason for that?
There's no specific reason. That it's purely visualization. So what winds up happening is if it adds an extra decade, typically what winds up happening with the 4 logs is it's showing from a value of 26 to about 262,000 or so. If you select 5 logs, it'll show the first log as that 2.6 to 26. So it's just showing you a little bit more of that negative space. There's a lot more to be discussed about visualization and log and by exponential, and that we can discuss in future sessions.
I think we'll talk much more about that when we cover compensation, because it's very useful then to change the scaling.
Yeah, and somebody's actually giving here a very good suggestion that you know, we may want to mention that there is an automated way of batch exporting PDFs and stats. You know, this would take a little bit a while here now to show, but it is true. It is there, and we can do it. Any reason? So I don't know. Here there's a question. Why did you make the stopping gate P3 and not P4? I actually missed that part.
I think the reason that I did that for this specific experiment was because the CD4 population was 50% roughly of my population, so I had a very robust number of cells there in that P4 gate, and I knew that going in based on population percentages. That's why I mentioned if it was a more rare event or anything like that, I could change this to P4 and adjust the number of events to record so that you're meeting your minimum criteria. What I tend to suggest, it's a general suggestion, if you're looking at more rare events, I might make sure that the events to record is at 1,000 or so that by the time you have 1,000 events in your final gate, you have a more robust CV for your data.
Okay. I think, I mean, those are all the questions that we had.
Okay, so we
were addressing.
Oh, actually,
Derek, I do have.
Go ahead, Roy.
You know, there were a few questions here on autofluorescence. So why, you know, why, Kathy, why did you choose the BV421 as an autofluorescent channel? I was explaining, so I was typing the answers here that, yes, we could have used FITSI. We could have used anything from blue, green, and orange as autofluorescent channels. But, you know, you may want to expand, you or Derek may want to expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would try normally to use maybe a channel that's closer to the PE, but then we would have had to explain compensation, I think, today. So we chose something that was far enough away there.
Right.
And also it does depend on your cells as well, because obviously cells are autofluorescent in different areas of the spectrum. So you don't want to necessarily go to an area where you have a very high background.
Right. Right.
And that's going to vary with your cells, as I say. So.
Okay.
So hopefully we've answered most of those questions. As we've been saying as we've been going along, is, you know, if you have anything you really want to cover, let us know. This has been very much an experiment from our point of view. We'll work out how it's gone later on when we get some feedback. So Rui, do you want to say something about the feedback?
Right. Yes. I'm actually. Well, first, I'm getting a lot of you know, good suggestions for the next topics. Many of them were, you know, we had the survey that we sent out, and so a lot of these topics are going to be covered, like, you know, compensation. Somebody's talking about setting up voltages. Actually, somebody also asked, and this is something that we can record maybe. Somebody was saying that they would love to see Kathy doing a session on tricks and tips and tricks in Diva, because I think they liked your some of your tricks that you show there. And yeah, just to mention that we will be sending a questionnaire link to all of you, to all the attendees. So, you know, please take a few minutes to fill this out, to give us more suggestions. Like Derek was saying, this was our first experiment doing a live session with Diva, so a webinar where we're actually working with the instrument. So we'll definitely be improving and based on your feedback also. So it's really important. So thank you very much. And we will have this webinar recorded and posted on the YouTube channel, the OpenFlow Cytometry YouTube channel that we created. and we're still thinking of ways that we can also start a discussion and a forum where you can actually post more questions and we can address them. And actually the community can address them, because it's very important to notice that this is OpenFlow cytometry, so it's open to everyone. I guess you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, sure. Hang on. There we go.
Okay, so we do have already at least two practical sessions scheduled. They're going to be once a month. So next month will be June 19th and then July 17th at the same time. We're broadcasting live from New York and from London. So it's very international, and we would love to make it even more international. And you know, I would encourage you guys to register here at this link here at the Crick Institute, where you also see a lot of other nice educational resources there that I assume, Derek, right? They're all publicly available also, right?
Yes, they are. Yes, yeah. All of the webinars that we've done are put up onto our YouTube site, which I can send. I can send anybody the link to if they wish.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
and in fact, you know, the way of getting to us is here.
Right. So exactly. So please reach out to us individually or to all of us, or through the OpenFlow Cytometry Gmail account. We do have Crick Institute and our fluorophore here at Memorial Sloan Kettering. We have Twitter accounts, so you know, feel free to follow us. We will be posting also a lot of these you know, announcements. So you know, follow us and you'll know all about what we're doing for sure. So I think that is it, right?
That was the last one? Us, yes, that was the last slide. So I can stop that share, and then you can see us in glorious Technicolor. But yes, thanks everybody for coming. As we've said several times, it's very much an experiment, and we value your feedback. So as Rui said, please take a few minutes. It's not a very big questionnaire. Fill that in, and that'll help us inform us what we're going to do next.
Thank you, everyone, for sticking around.
Thanks all for coming, and hopefully we'll see some of you soon.